And we are live. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're just going to give it a few minutes for folks to make their way in before we get started. But Chad, Gavin, good morning. How are you
Hey,
doing?
Andy, how's it going?
Good
Fine.
morning. Doing great.
We
Well
need some
caffeinated.
elevator music or some pump up jams or something.
Yeah, I think some like Black Sabbath or hard rock would be
Is
appropriate.
that what you're going for? My son, 16, just discovered Alice in Chains.
Oh,
Like, I never listened to Alice in Chains. Wow, okay. Good, good. Like, yeah.
for our next webinar, that would be a way to
You got
really.
to spell it GNAR, though, for me, Andy, if you do that.
I have to
With
do what?
an R.
Uh,
With an R.
oh,
GNAR. Sorry. Having too
uh,
much fun.
if you're just joining us, you are not in the wrong place. We very much appreciate you being here. We just want to give folks who are making their way in another few seconds before we get started. So yeah, we'll officially begin in around 30 seconds. But thank you so much for being here, and hope your February is off to a good start.
Andy, I know you walked me through this platform earlier. Do we get to see here how many folks are watching? Is that obvious anywhere?
It's not. It's not. But
Perfect.
I can. There are kind of like in the administrative settings in another place. It's visible.
Don't need to worry about it. That
But
way, Gavin and I won't get stage fright.
yeah. And if you do, I'm sure the folks on this call will be understanding, and it'll be a supportive group.
Cool.
So with that, I think let's go ahead and get started. So we're really excited that you've joined us for today's webinar, Sentry's software licensing journey and why it matters for you, with Chad Whitaker, Sentry's head of open source, and Gavin Z, Sentry's head of commercial transactions. My name is Andy Drugriv. I'm on the team at FOSSA. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before I go over our agenda and introduce Chad and Gavin, I do have a few housekeeping points to go over. First, we will do our best to answer your questions as you submit them, and we will also have a few minutes at the end if we don't get to everything for more Q&A. So please post any questions that you may have in the questions section of your BrightTalk console. Next, this webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent out to you after the event. And we at FOSSA will also be following up with you after the webinar with some additional resources, contact information for Chad and Gavin, LinkedIn for Chad and Gavin, I should say, and to see if there's anything we can do to help your organization with software license compliance. So now let's take a look at today's agenda. We will start by discussing the concept of open source sustainability, which is a foundational principle for Sentry and offers a lot of the context for what we'll cover in today's presentation. We'll then get into source available licensing models and how they compare to open source before diving into the specifics of how and why Sentry developed and adopted a new source available license, the functional source license. Excuse me. We'll then conclude the presentation with some insights and recommendations based on firsthand experience from our guests from Sentry on managing compliance and some of the IP considerations that can come with using software under open source and software under source available licenses. So now, before I officially kick things off and hand it over to Chad and Gavin, I just wanted to say a few quick words about FOSSA for folks who are not familiar with us. We provide technology that helps organizations manage risks from using open source software. And so specifically, that's to identify, detect, comply with open source software licenses and their requirements, like creating attribution notices. And although source available is a distinct category from open source, we do support that as well. And then our platform also has vulnerability management and SBOM functionality.
Gavin, do you see our logo up there?
I do not see our logo up there, but we are also FOSSA customers.
Yeah, we're gonna have to.
Some logos are too special to be included for marketing purposes, but
Well
no,
played. Well played.
we are extremely proud and grateful that Sentry is among the FOSSA customers. So thank you both. And with that, let's transition to some speaker introductions, and starting with Chad. who is the head of open source at Sentry. And Chad, maybe you could see a few more words about your background and focus areas.
Sure thing. Yeah, so I've been at Sentry for about 3 years now, a little over 3. I came as an engineer, and then a couple years ago, kind of leveled up our open source team into a proper open source program office. Became head of open source at that point. But long time Sentry user, Sentry customer, go way back kind of in the open source community with some of the early Sentry folks. Yeah, and before, I guess going through the bullets here, before working here at Sentry, I did a startup around open source sustainability, a crowdfunding platform for open source. Yeah, a background in open source sustainability. And then I don't know if I'll need it, but I've got my bucket hat in case I do. So I do like to wear a bucket hat.
And this is officially the most fashionable webinar FOSSA has ever done. But thank you, Chad, for that overview. And Gavin, similar question for you. Just wondering if you could share a bit about yourself and focus areas.
Sure, no problem, Andy. So I joined Sentry at the same time as Chad. So at Sentry, in addition to supporting Chad's team, I support our go-to-market teams in negotiating contracts, getting sales deals done. Before that, I was in private practice representing companies similar to Sentry in all of their technology transactions matters.
Excellent. And now just a few quick words for folks if you're on this webinar and have not heard of Sentry, just to give you that context. They're a leader in application performance and error monitoring, used by many developers across many organizations, countries, continents. So, a very valuable and frequently used product in kind of this whole application development world. They actually started as an open source side project in 2008. And that sort of those roots in the open source community, I think, explain a lot of the company's current focus on open source and some of what we're going to discuss today. So with that, let's kick things off with a discussion of open source sustainability. And would love your take on, first of all, what this means. It's a term that I think, we do hear periodically in the open source community, but what it means to you and why it's important.
Sure, thanks, Andy. Yeah, so really the way we're proceeding here is we're kind of starting with a big picture and we're zooming in and zooming in and zooming in. So kind of at the highest level here, for us at Sentry, we can't talk about licensing without talking about sustainability, because for us, it's part of sustainability and how we think about that. So there's really two sides to sustainability, and that's the bullet points you see here. And really for us, a lot of it boils down to our values in open source. Of course, open source is rooted in free software and the 4 freedoms, the freedom to run and modify and share and distribute changes to software. And we do value that. And we also value, and have come to value more, more and more through the years, a concept of developer sustainability. And we think about that in 2 ways. On the one hand, we think about our kind of upstream dependencies, the supply chain, the non-commercial libraries and frameworks that we depend on. And we want to make sure that our upstream supply chain is healthy. And so we do a lot with funding into that ecosystem. And that's one aspect of sustainability. So that's not the focus of this talk, but that's kind of part of the bigger picture for us. What we're going to go into here is the other side for us, which is the licensing side. Because for Sentry, as Andy mentioned, we started life as an open source side project way back in 2008, started commercializing kind of lightly in 2012, but really took venture capital in 2015 and started our growth trajectory. And we've always wanted to make our core product as open source as possible. And that's presented challenges as we've grown as a business. So for us, licensing is about making Sentry itself sustainable so that we can continue producing and building Sentry and making it the best product that we can. So 2 sides to sustainability for us, the funding, but then also the licensing. And it's really about balancing user freedom with developer sustainability. Is that good for an overview, Andy?
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. And you did mention this, but just to sort of flesh it out a little bit more, maybe you could speak to why a strong license compliance program you view as a particularly important part in promoting and really enabling open source sustainability?
Sure. Happy to take that, Andy. I think touching on Chad's second point about developer sustainability, whether we're talking about open source or source available licenses, the underlying software is proprietary, and complying with the associated license terms is critical to promoting sustainability for the software authors.
Yeah. And I think, my last question here, you call out kind of your financial investment in the open source community. And I'm wondering if you might have any recommendations or strategies for folks at other companies who, maybe would like to see their organizations take similar strides and, increase their level of support for the open source community.
Sure. So this is obviously a big topic and could be a webinar all its own. But for now, where I would point folks, we have an effort called FOSS Funders, FOSS Funders, fossfunders.com. And it's a group of companies like Sentry. We've got Microsoft in there, Spotify, some others. I think we're up to like 14 folks now. Everyone who kind of has a program, an intentional program in funding upstream dependencies is welcome to join this group and to kind of tell their story about how they think about it. And really, that's kind of a group of practitioners to develop best practices around funding open source. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, fossfunders.com is the place to go there. And happy to follow up with anybody after the call about that as well. But yeah, a lot of good info there.
Cool. So before we dive into, I think, the specifics of the functional source license, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, is a new source available license that the Sentry team created and adopted, as well as discussing some of the strategies around managing compliance. I think it'll be helpful to spend a minute discussing just sort of the big picture about like what the actual differences are between source available and open source licenses. We have some of them sort of depicted in this table, but I'm wondering if you could maybe talk us through what the similarities are, what the differences are, how these licensing models compare.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest difference is shown on this slide, Andy, is that for a true open source license, as recognized by the OSI, there can only be conditions on the use of the software, but not restrictions on the use of the software. Whereas with source available licenses, there's a little bit more flexibility in the ability to place restrictions on use in addition to conditions.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned obviously conditions and restrictions being this sort of key distinction. Can you expand on that a little bit more? I know these are kind of similar concepts, but there are meaningful differences between a condition and a restriction.
Absolutely. So a condition means that you have to do something in order to comply with the license terms. At the simplest level, this could be including like a copyright notice or a copy of the license when you distribute the code. At the more complicated level, this could involve releasing the source code for your own proprietary software that is part of the combined work. A restriction, unlike a condition, is a prohibition on doing something with the licensed software. And a common example today of a condition, of a restriction, would be not using the licensed software to provide a competing commercial service.
Wait, so Gavin, so a condition is what you have to do, what you must do, and a restriction is what you must not do, what you can't.
That's right.
So we actually have a question that just came in, and I think probably good to address it now because it is, I think, another one of these sort of like higher level conceptual parts of the conversation, which is, why is the ability to place restrictions a good thing?
Chad, you want to take this?
Sure. The ability to place restrictions a good thing? Well, William, I'm seeing your name here in the sidebar. I wish we could interact a little more directly to understand your question. So let me take a crack at it and make sure, hopefully I get somewhere in the ballpark. The ability to place restrictions, it's a good thing. I mean, we're going to hit this later in this call. For us at Sentry, we're a company. and we produce this product. It's called Sentry, and we want to keep producing that product. And experientially, we discovered that let's see, don't such restrictions represent a failure of business model? Okay, well, in our experience, there were existential threats to our business from much larger companies that threatened our business model. And so the ability to place restrictions on the use of the code that we were writing, that we had been writing for 10 plus years at the time that these risks kind of started to materialize, it was a very good thing for our business. I don't know. I feel like
Yeah,
the simple answer is the best at this point, and if you want to come back to it later, we can.
Yeah, I think that when we discuss some of the specific provisions in the functional source license that sort of, lay out the restrictions we're talking about, and even source of there's a range of restrictions that can be applied in source available, but I think, we're talking about the Sentry's license in particular, like it's pretty narrowly crafted, the restrictions. It's not like nobody can do anything with it. It's mostly like if you're a competitor, don't do this. So I think that's also context, but keep the questions coming. Definitely appreciate them. I think that kind of our next slide and to Chad's earlier point, we're sort of starting broad and then kind of narrowing in on some of the really core concepts for this webinar. Is that when we talk about source available licensing, it sounds like we're starting to see some consolidation around two primary types of models, open core and delayed open source. Can you discuss these, how open core and delayed open source are similar and how they're different?
Sure. Bill, I'm noodling on your question still too. We'll see if we can get a better answer for you as we go through this. So in terms of open core and delayed open source, right, so zooming in. So sustainability, licensing, source available, open source. In the same way that we've kind of seen open source shake out over the years into two kind of basic categories of open source, namely copyleft and permissive approaches to open source. We think that there's something similar happening in source available. And it's happening, it's kind of trailing behind, open source, the basic patterns were in place, pretty soon after, the term was coined, obviously, in 1998. The Apache license, I think, was 2004. And so source available is kind of, following a similar pattern, but maybe a couple decades behind open source. And what we see those patterns shaping up as is open core on the one hand, delayed open source on the other. And the way I like to think about these is time and space, if I can do it that way. So open core, again, these are source available, so they're placing restrictions, things you are not allowed to do with the software. Open core places its restrictions in quote unquote space, meaning certain features, the product surface area, the feature set. So these features are available, so think of like GitLab's community edition is, pure open source, GPL, I think it is, right? And then they have enterprise edition, which includes code that is not open source, that's under a proprietary license, in perpetuity. And the distinction is based on the feature set. So that's open core. Then on the delayed open source side, the restrictions are based in time, not in space or features. So Sentry's full product is delayed open source, meaning we never have a conversation like, well, should this feature go into the open source version, the community version, or the enterprise version? That distinction doesn't exist at Sentry. All features, there's one Sentry with all the features, and the restriction is based in time. We were using the business source license. Now we're doing the functional source license. But both of those are these delayed open source licenses. You can see here a link to a white paper that the Open Source Initiative put out. Disclaimer: Sentry was the underwriter for this paper, this research paper, into this practice of time-based license restrictions in delayed open source. So that's the distinctions here. So we see, licensing is a component of sustainability. Under licensing, we've got source available and open source. Under source available, we've got these two patterns, open core and delayed open source. How am I doing, Andy?
Yeah, no, I think that was a great explanation and sort
Good.
of covered everything that I was personally wondering about.
Mhm.
And I think kind of a good transition into now your journey at Sentry. Where you, I think, actually started as a side project, as you mentioned. The first license you were under was the BSD 3 clause, which is obviously a permissive license. Then some changes along the way, and
Mhm.
wondering if you could just talk us through some of the highlights on your path and what some of the important considerations were around some of the licensing decisions that you did make.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, at the very beginning, we weren't even open source in the strict sense because we didn't have a license at all. 2008 started as this 70-line Django plugin, and there was no license on it. Because this was the era when kind of a new generation of developers was coming in. Kind of after the first wave of open source in '98, so 2008. You got a lot of developers that are starting out on GitHub. GitHub was just getting started, and sharing code was just normal. It's what you did, and a lot of folks didn't want to be bothered with licensing and put up code with no license on it. And so that's where we started. So it was still the next year that we put the BSD 3 on it. David Kramer, our technical co-founder, and then 2012, I think I mentioned earlier, started kind of lightly commercializing. 2015 is when we took venture capital, started growing. And Bill, I think this is going to help with your question. One major thing to understand about Sentry is there's a post that was up on GitHub's blog a while ago that uses this term single source. Sentry is a single source, has always been a single source open source project, meaning, the Sentry, the company, are the ones that have built 96+% of Sentry. And, this was true in 2008. It was true in 2012. It was true in 2015. It's been true the whole way through. If somebody's hacking on Sentry, we hire them and they work with us. And that idea of it being our core product that we're trying to make as open as possible, that's, I think, what helps us tease apart a kind of open source projects like Linux that are really shared assets across a number of organizations versus something like Sentry, a product like Sentry that's really product led. It's really designed to be a robust like hard to do user interface as well. Yeah, so we've been building Sentry. Kind of our product vision is the product vision for Sentry the company. So then in terms of licensing, it was 2019 when we, again, got to be kind of big enough that kind of some bigger fish in the pond started noticing us and were really, kind of threatening our business model. And that's when we, learned about the BSL, the business source license, which is one of these delayed open source licenses. And we adopted it in 2019. And interestingly, that relicensing had no effect on our contributor community. Like I said, that actual contributor community has always been, a smaller portion for us. But the relicensing had no effect for us. There was no viable fork of Sentry at that point or anything like that. What it did is it gave us that developer sustainability to keep producing the software. So then fast forward to 2023, BSL is great with the time delay, but it's parameterized. It's got this really big hole in the middle of it called the additional use grant, right, Gavin? Do I have it right?
Yeah.
Additional use grant that is kind of a fill in the blank. And every company that adopts BSL fills it in differently. So HashiCorp's BSL is a totally different license than Sentry's BSL, than MariaDB's BSL, et cetera. So by 2023, we were at a point where we wanted to kind of move the industry forward, move the community forward, move the conversation forward on this delayed open source publishing approach. And we felt like it was time to evolve the BSL, fix some of these problems with it. And that's when we came up with the FSL, which we adopted. I'll give the shout out here, Andy. I'll let you know just before this call started. Just this morning, we had our fourth product adopt the FSL. It's been out a few months now. So shout out to Git Butler, our newest adopter of the FSL. So that's where we're at.
Excellent. So a few more quick questions that are closely related to this slide. The first, is Sentry a SaaS or on-prem product?
So it's both. Our commercial product is multi-tenant SaaS, but our FSL licensed product is on-prem deployment.
Yeah, but again, it's one product. We deploy the same feature set to SaaS, whether SaaS paid, SaaS free. I think of we call it self-hosted. I think of self-hosted as our freer tier, because it's the same product set. You just run it yourself.
Yeah.
Does that answer that?
I think there's kind of a related question here, which folks in the audience might be even thinking of, is like, why didn't you just use AGPL? Well, why source available over AGPL?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in coming up with our license decisioning, we thought about the options that were available, and we actually think that the FSL and prior to that the BSL posed fewer hurdles to adoption than for our users than AGPL would. The main thing that we were concerned about was developer sustainability, right? How do we protect the investment that we've made in our software, but how do we let users use it without placing undue burdens on them? And from our perspective, it's really easy for our users to use Sentry under the FSL. It doesn't require them to do anything if they just want to use it for their own purposes, whereas AGPL causes all sorts of additional challenges for them from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, and I think your response there, it kind of speaks to another question that we received, which is, given your concerns, and I think the concerns you highlighted earlier about kind of your competitive landscape and larger companies perhaps using Sentry for their own profit-driven reasons. Given those concerns, why are you even staying close to a FOSS model? Wouldn't it be better served as a proprietary offering?
I mean, we're staying close to a FOSS model because we're developers and open source is awesome. I mean, there's kind of, there's kind of a cynical answer to this, and there's the flip side of it is maybe more genuine answer to this. Open source is a brand. At the end of the day, open source is a brand. This is the way I introduce it to everybody that joins Sentry, and I have an onboarding call with everybody that joins Sentry for the most part. I say open source is a powerful brand in the software industry. It's defined by a certain kind of licensing that's designed to encode a public community-centric approach to building software. So we're a developer tools company. Open source and developers are, those communities overlap to such a great extent at this point. Again, we're developers. We identify with open source. We want to be part of it. We value user freedom. We like to use open source. We like to give back. We like other people to read our code. We like to share our code with developers. And of course, we value sustainability. And so we need to balance those two. But just because we need to balance those two doesn't mean that we don't actually genuinely value open source. So we're open source because we're open source, because that's core to our company's culture and what we believe in and value.
Yeah. And one final question on this slide. There has been a lot of activity in the source available space in recent years, and of course, including what you mentioned about another new adoption of the FSL today. But HashiCorp, there's been a number of examples. Why do you think the source available space, there's been more activity in it recently?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is for exactly the same reason we made our initial decision to relicense from the BSD to the BSL. It's really that the proliferation of enterprise cloud computing has raised new challenges to developer sustainability, and really outside of the AGPL, there aren't any open source licenses that have been written to address that challenge.
Great. And so now with this context, let's talk about what it was like to develop a new source available license. Starting with your motivations for publishing and adopting this new license. And I know you've discussed a few of them, but just, in those first conversations, why, how did this come up? Why did this come up? What drove you forward toward developing the functional source license?
Sure. So again, FSL is an example, zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. It's one of these delayed open source licenses. We'd been using the business source license, which MariaDB wrote in 2016, if I remember right. But it had these kind of drawbacks to it. And again, the biggest one is that additional use grant, which really made every BSL implementation, makes every BSL implementation a separate document that, you all in your compliance departments, like if BSL comes in, developer comes to you, with a BSL licensed piece of software, you can't just see, oh, it's BSL, yes or no. You have to slow down and actually read the whole thing to understand what it's actually saying before you can, make a decision on that. And that and a couple other kind of parameters in it, so it can be any change license, it can be any term. So the default is 4 years. That's what most people use for the BSL, but some do 3. But again, there's variables in it. And what we saw is that those variables, our analysis was those variables slow the adoption of the BSL. We think that delayed open source is a really worthy way to go with source available, because in a couple of years you've got genuinely open source software. So we think delayed open source is a worthy approach, but these kind of variables in the BSL we think slow its adoption in the industry. So with FSL, our goal is to kind of take those parameters and make them not parameters anymore. So that FSL is a very clearly understood thing, and our hope is that this can help drive its adoption. And again, we've grown our FSL adoption by 33% just this morning, from 3 to 4 projects. So does that help a bit, Andy, with
Yeah,
the information
absolutely.
behind it?
I think that's a great explanation. And, drilling down into one of the kind of areas that we cover here, which is, the lack of standardization, making automation, difficult. Like, how does the inability to automate impact compliance initiatives? And I guess I'm thinking of this more on the end user side of things, where if you want to, use software licensed under a source available license, like, the BSL, like, how would that lack of standardization and the resulting inability to automate perhaps impair or make more challenging compliance initiatives?
Sure. So I mean, I think we at Sentry we kind of view everything through a developer lens. We're a company that's developers who are building tools for developers, and I think one of the things that we want to make sure happens is that we're able to have short development cycles. When you can't automate, and you can't like clear once and clear all, like in terms of like a acceptable license, that means that every time somebody comes with a new dependency or tool that's licensed under something like the BSL, there needs to be a bespoke legal review, and then you're adding cycles because now the developers are waiting for legal to review and comment. Whereas with the FSL, once you've reviewed it once for a particular use case, you can just clear it through your policies, and you're able to automate.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I think my final question here is, now that you've been through this process of creating and adopting a new license, what advice would you have for organizations or individuals thinking about going a similar path and creating a new license of their own?
Sure. I mean, I think it's really about thinking about what your end goal is and working backwards from that. So it's like, what use cases are you trying to prohibit or make more difficult, or do you care about widespread adoption, or are you more concerned with protecting your own proprietary code? Is there another license that exists out there that will already cover all the things you need?
That's kind of where I would go with it, Gavin. Don't. License proliferation is just as much a thing in source available as it has been in open source. And I think going back to what we were saying earlier, in open source, we've seen kind of this convergence around, BSD, MIT, GPL, Apache, this handful of core licenses, kind of the copyleft and the permissive. With FSL, we're really hoping we can kind of crystallize and catalyze kind of a convergence in source available, particularly around the delayed open source side. going back a little bit, Andy, to some of the process around developing FSL, I want to give the shout out to Heather Meeker, who helped us a lot with this. Heather has had her, her finger in the pot on pretty much every source available variation in the past 20 years. So she's helped craft a lot of these licenses. She helped us with this one, but it really was a community effort. I mean, a little backstory. This might be kind of a tangent, but we had really a conversation that started for us right before HashiCorp did their BSL change. We changed an acquisition called CodeCov, and we released that under the BSL, and that was the opportunity for a lot of conversation around licensing. That's what really started us on this path towards the FSL, and it really was a community effort because we got a lot of conversation going there, and then kind of funneled it into let's do something, because what's always happened is like people put out a license, even BSL, there's no stewardship of it. There's no kind of driving adoption of it. And so we've got like the path is littered with source available license that one company has used and has kind of fizzled. BSL is the one that's kind of got the most traction. But like we said, it's kind of got these problems that slow its adoption. So we really tried to make this a community effort. Sentry is, investing in this, working with others to adopt it, and to, talk about maybe some limitations with the 1.0 version, and do we need a 1.1? So we really are trying to build momentum around this in a way that we haven't seen with some of the other options. So yeah, if you need to write your own, go for it. But we would love to have you join us. And yeah.
We have a comment from Heather who says, thanks for the shout out.
Hey, Heather.
Thanks
Hi,
Heather.
Thanks for your help.
Yes. Okay. So now let's talk about a few of the specific provisions in the functional source license. And what are some of the big ones? Why are they important? I think would be a place to start here.
All right. Who's on this one, Gavin? Rock, paper, scissors?
Go for it, Chad.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So going back to, kind of this theme of taking the BSL and taking the parts of it that were variable and kind of pinning those down, just walking through the slide here, BSL can convert to any license. With FSL, we wanted to narrow that down. And again, we're in the permissive camp of kind of open source. And so as we think about source available, we want to stay in that permissive camp. So we went with Apache and MIT as the only two possible change licenses. And this next one's even more significant. BSL has a 4-year term after which the license, the software is released under an open source license. And for FSL, we narrowed that down to 2 years. And actually, since doing FSL, I learned that I believe the IRS, software depreciation guidelines say 3 years, that the worth of software is 3 years. So that actually lines up, Gavin, I think, and Heather and others, with where we ended up with this, taking it from 4 years, at which point our intuition was like, after 4 years, software is basically worthless. The world moves so fast. We felt like 2 years was a good kind of compromise. And I think that kind of 3-year, IRS, guideline kind of validates that for us. After 2 years, that's real enough that it's like, there's still some value there that you're giving to open source. But really, this helps a lot with, vendor lock-in, with, a single source producer like Sentry. If anything were ever to happen to Sentry, it's only 2 years before, the current code is all open source. So MIT or Apache, 2-year term. And then the usage restrictions are really around competing use. So this is a non-compete license at its heart. FSL is tuned for SaaS companies. That doesn't mean that it can't be used for others, but Sentry, that's our business model, is SaaS. And so we tuned it for that. And then, yes, we do have some attribution, the notices there. Yeah, it's a good license.
I think one of the questions that came in that we see a lot when it comes to source available licenses in general because a lot of them do have prohibitions on competing use.
Mhm.
But it's, how do you define competition? What about non-competing monetization? Is using versus might use?
Bill, we got to jump on the after party call. You had a lot of great questions. We could have a good conversation. How do you define competition? Gavin, do you want to go through it?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, at least in the FSL itself, like the competing use is not using for like competing commercial purposes. So in essence, not standing up like a SaaS service using the underlying software.
I'm going to try and channel Heather here, and Heather, if you can get another question, maybe you'll answer this. You had a few different definitions of competition. One, and they're in here. Competing uses specifically include using the software. I'm reading the license text now, as a substitute for any of our products or services, in a way that exposes the APIs of the software, or in a product or service that offers the same or substantially similar functionality to the software. So that's our definition in the license text. But kind of that economic substitution was definitely one of the things that I remember, Heather, you bringing to the table.
I think, obviously one of the core tenets of source available is that the source code is available. And that brings up another question, which is, why do your customers really want access to your source code? Is this something you've asked them?
So again, with Sentry, we don't monetize self-hosted. So a big part of having the access to the source code is we actually, package it up for, in our case, we provide a packaging of Sentry for small volume and proof of concept deploys. So access to the source code in that sense, it's not just reading it, it's running it. We've got a lot of people doing that. So we know that they want access to the source code for that reason. I guess that's the simple answer.
Great. And so far, this webinar has sort of been explaining the concepts of source available and discussing Sentry's sort of behind the scenes, under the hood look at developing a new license. And I think now, as we near the end of the webinar, I want to transition into a slightly different topic, which is lessons learned and recommendations to help organizations manage compliance on their end of things. And I think, let's start with open source license compliance. As we've established, even though Sentry is licensed under a source available license, open source is super important to you. Open source license compliance is super important to you. And so to start, could you touch on some of the pillars of your open source license compliance program? Are there any processes or best practices that work particularly well for you?
Sure, happy to do that. I mean, I think once again, touching upon this earlier a little bit, we're very developer focused here, and so our number one goal in running open source compliance is really to try to not block our developers and try to keep things moving quickly and smoothly as much as possible. And really for us, that means automating. So having a tool that can be in our CI/CD, that can run the checks, and that for everything that's green passes right through, and then for anything that gets flagged, there's like a quick way for us to triage, review, and clear. And for us, the triage process just means having an open source Slack channel where if something does get hung up, we're immediately available to respond.
Great. This is another comment, and this I think is to kind of the conversation we were having on the last slide about competition.
Yeah, there you go.
From Heather, competition is usually expressed as an economic matter, parentheses, substitute goods, functional, parentheses, provides same functionality or direct access to APIs, or a quote value add requirement. So that hopefully clears up kind of some of the question about how we define competition. And by we, I mean not me, but yeah. Then on the open source license compliance angle, I do have to ask, being from FOSSA, why did you choose us? to help with license compliance, what about FOSSA do you like as a license compliance tool?
Sure, absolutely. I think for us, the key factors in choosing FOSSA initially were the policy customization options, and the UI was kind of pretty intuitive and easy for us to use. I think we're now in our, I want to say, second year or third year, maybe even, of using FOSSA now. And I think the thing that's really stood out beyond that has been the support that we've gotten from the team. So, shout out to like Cortez, Amanda, Sarah for all the help that you've given us.
Excellent. And so I think, we've discussed now open source license compliance, risk management. Let's talk about source available license compliance. And this is obviously perhaps a less mature field, and still one that I think folks are trying to figure out as source available licenses become more popular. But, just again, a kind of a similar question as I asked about open source, which is like, how do you recommend organizations think about managing compliance with source available licenses? What are some of the most important considerations and initiatives?
Sure. I think it's really doing the same analysis that you would do for weak or strong copyleft licenses. So that really means understanding what the requirements are of the underlying license, and then knowing what your use cases are and whether your use cases are going to trigger any of the obligations or violate any of the obligations, right? So I guess when we talk about the open source or copyleft, are you modifying the code? Are you going to need to publish your own code? Or if we think about source available, are you going to use it in a way that's going to violate like the restrictions that we talked about before?
Competition.
Got
I'd
it.
say to tag on to that, something I'd really love to see, a real win for the FSL would be if, as an industry, we can come to an understanding that it's okay to contribute upstream to FSL projects. I think that's an interesting area to explore. Obviously this is early days, but that's something that I would keep an eye on the next year, 2, 3, and see how that unfolds.
Yeah. And just a note to folks watching this, do feel free, if you have questions that we haven't answered, to submit them. We are nearing the end of the presentation, so get them in now, although you will also, of course, have an opportunity to reach out to us after, if you so like. So I think, a follow-up question to what we've discussed so far, is that license compliance policies like, approved, flagged, denied types of licenses, where, permissive would be approved, copyleft might be, a strong copyleft might be denied, so on and so forth. They tend to be at the core of an open source license compliance program. Understanding that different organizations have different risk tolerance and different types of products, how would you recommend organizations account for source available when creating compliance policies?
Sure. I think it's similar to open source. Make sure that you cover the licenses in your policy from an automation perspective. And I think we talked about this before a little bit, but a static license is pretty easy to automate against. It's the ones like BSL where you can't automate, but you build into your policy that needs to be reviewed every time, right? I think that's how we would recommend managing.
Yeah. And the last question I have here, and this sort of brings us somewhat full circle, is even though the FSL does seek to standardize a lot of, basically does seek to be a standardized license, a lot of the common source available licenses today are not standardized, which, as we've discussed, does pose problems for compliance. So sort of with that context, like, how do you suggest organizations, do you have any suggestions to help organizations manage compliance with the many source available licenses that are not standardized?
I think we kind of have a catch-all in our own policy, which is, hey, here's the list of everything that is permitted, and if it's not on that list, raise your hand, please, and come talk to us.
Yeah, Yeah. Well, that concludes today's presentation. I'll leave it open another minute if folks want to get any more questions in. But if not, I think this was a really wonderful overview, Chad and Gavin. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today and talk about developing a new software license and some of the lessons learned from that process. So can't thank you enough for doing this.
Andy, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andy.
Excellent. Well, with that, we will call it. Like I said, do keep an eye out in the next 2 days. You'll be getting emails from us that will have the LinkedIn links for both Chad and Gavin. If you have additional questions that we didn't get to that you want to ask them, and you can also get in touch with the FOSSA team that way. So with that, thanks again so much, Chad, Gavin. Thanks again so much to everyone for taking time out of your day to be here. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday and rest of your week.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you,
Thank
Gavin.
you, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks, Bill.